Hi, everyone. I'm Elisa Becher from the Center for the Humanities here at the CUNY Graduate Center. I'm kind of in a little shock to see so many people braving the elements. It makes me a proud New Yorker to see all of you out here for this event, so thank you so much for coming. We're really excited to have you here for this talk with Ashley Dawson, Jason Moore, Cindi Katz, and Omar Dahbour, The End of Cheap Nature. It is part of a research team called Art, Activism, and the Environment, which is under a bigger umbrella of a Mellon seminar on public engagement and collaborative research, which is a 2-year grant we're currently running out of the Center for the Humanities that's pairing faculty from all different CUNY schools and PhD students at the Graduate Center with community partners around the city and beyond to come up with really incredible collaborative projects that tackle important issues in the academy and in social justice. So I encourage you to look at our website. We have a really robust public programming calendar, especially this March. We have a lot of events happening. So make sure to sign up for our mailing list. And we are also about to launch our new Lost and Found chapbook. So there's information on that as well. We are live streaming tonight's event, so I'll ask all of the panelists, as well as anyone who has a question, to use the microphone. So everyone who's tuning in who did not brave it in this weather, to use the microphone when they talk. And now I'm going to hand it over to Ashley.
Thanks so much, Elisa. Thank you all very much for coming out tonight despite the fearsome weather. It's good to see you all. I'd like to thank the Center for the Humanities for sponsoring this event, and also the Mellon Foundation for sponsoring the public engagement seminar, of which it is a part. So let me just tell you how we're planning the evening. We're going to ask Jason Moore to give a bit of an introduction to his book, and then we're going to have responses from the other panelists, following which we'll have a bit of a conversation between us up here, and then we'll open the floor to questions from all of you. So I hope it'll be a very lively evening, and I'm looking forward to an interesting conversation between all of us. So let me start out by introducing the people up here in front of you. As I mentioned, I'm Ashley Dawson. I'm a professor of English here at the Grad Center and the College of Staten Island. Over on my far left is Omar Dahbour. He's professor of philosophy at the Grad Center and also at Hunter College. He is the author of Self-Determination Without Nationalism, a theory of post-national sovereignty, which was published by Temple University Press in 2013, and also of The Illusion of the Peoples, a critique of national self-determination from Roman and Littlefield in 2003. Sitting next to him is Cindi Katz. Cindi is professor of geography in environmental psychology and women's studies at the Graduate Center. And her work concerns social reproduction and the production of space, place, and nature. She's the author of Growing Up Global, Economic Restructuring and Children's Everyday Lives, which was published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2004. And she's the editor with Janice Monk of Full Circle, Geographies of Gender, over the life course from Routledge in 1993. And also editor of Life's Work, Geographies of Social Reproduction, which was co-edited with Sally Marston and Catherine Mitchell and published by Blackwell in 2004. And sitting just next to me, of course, is Jason W. Moore. He's an environmental historian and historical geographer at Binghamton University, where he's an associate professor of sociology. He's the author of Capitalism in the Web of Life, which was published by Verso in 2015, of Anthropocene or Capitalocene, Nature, History, and the Crisis of Capitalism, out from PM Press in 2016, and then, of course, most recently with Raj Patel of A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, published by University of California Press last year, 2017. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Jason to introduce his work.
Sure,
yeah.
All right, thank you, Ashley. What a treat it is to be here tonight, despite the inclement weather. So, a history of the world in 7 cheap things is at least 2 things. One is a kind of popularization of the themes and the more limited scholarly conversation around what we've called world ecology. World ecology is an effort to fundamentally rethink and unthink questions of what in the past have been called nature society, and to critique the kinds of analytical, conceptual dualisms of nature and society, but also to highlight how nature and society in the uppercase formed real abstractions that were involved in the actually existing violence of colonialism, of racial and gender domination, and of producing cheap natures of all kinds, including the manifold forms of human work. And what we're doing in 7 Cheap Things is amplifies that, popularizes that, but I think for me really does something beyond the usual discussions of cheapness that revolve around questions of cost and that revolve around questions of externalities. And I think 2 of those themes are really central. One is to try to shift decisively the terrain of conceptualizing humans in the web of life and capitalism in the web of life from a theme of degradation to one centered on work, and to understand that work occupies many forms. That seems a little deafening, but we'll try to keep that in good shape. And I won't be too distracted there. And so to move from discussions of environmental degradation as the degradation of soils and trees and forests and fields, and we talk a lot about that too, but to understand that capitalism thrives when it can do more than simply destroy, when it can put natures of all kinds, including human natures, to work, and that the figure of the worker is not only the industrial worker, not only the wage worker, but manifold forms of work, and that at the center of understanding capital accumulation over the longue durée and the origins of our planetary crisis is to see how there is not only a process of accumulation by capitalization through the cash nexus, but also accumulation by appropriation. That is the extra economic appropriation of the unpaid work of, in Maria Mies's wonderful turn of phrase, women, nature, and colonies. Now, so obviously that brings us on to a whole set of questions that the Marxist tradition has been, let us say, uneven in dealing with. That is questions of the state, questions of geopower, questions of violence. In traditional and even many contemporary accounts of the rise of capitalism, this is an economic process in which the role of state violence, in which the nexus of states and finance are disconnected. And even when they are, as in accounts like Giovanni Arrighi's, they are disconnected from the geographies of everyday life and the geographies of planetary transformation. So that's another part of what we're trying to do in 7 Cheap Things, is to point out cheapness is not just about cost reduction, but about the cheapening of life, of work, and the transformation of the world into zones of nature and society. And oh, by the way, most human beings historically, and perhaps even in the present, were moved in whole or in part into the zone of nature. So making the point that this ontological, philosophical, and analytical distinction is not merely in the realm of ideas, but is indeed, and we see this across the really 6 cheap things, because nature is never a cheap thing, but a way to make other things cheap. We see how this binary of nature and society, of humanity and nature, which is so powerful in the discourse around the Anthropocene and around the great mythic category of anthropogenic climate change. Of course, it's not anthropogenic, it's capitalogenic. And that we can see how the binary of humanity and nature developed and formed an interlocking series of actual practices of domination, of cheapening, that were not limited, of course, to nature and humanity, that were extended and nurtured racial binaries, gendered binaries, and reinforced a class system of exploitation, but also reinforced a system of accumulating capital in which the pedestal of socially necessary labor time, of wage work, of monetized work, the pedestal of that was always and at every point socially necessary unpaid work, the unpaid work of women, nature, and colonies. So this is an attempt really to bring together some of the fundamental themes of Marxism, but also of radical thought across the 20th century, and to ground it in a world historical imagination that's not just a story of systemic determination. To take seriously the idea that capitalism is in itself a world historical place with its own relations of power, of systems of production and reproduction, its own logics of governance, its own ways of mapping and securing and surveilling and maintaining space, and parts of nature, of transforming natures into particular fragments. To take it seriously that capitalism is not just floating out there in the ether, it is a real historical geographical place. And to situate the present crisis within a longer history that goes beyond the industrial fetishism that has become very influential in recent years around fossil capitalism. It did not all begin in England. It did not all begin with the Industrial Revolution. And indeed, if we want to start to pull at those threads, we ought to look at the whole complex of racism, of genocide, and of gendered divisions of labor that were the precondition for so-called fossil capital. So we should link it, in other words, to the set of relationships of power, capital, and nature, world ecological relations that originated in 1492. All right.
Thanks so much.
Is this working? Yes, it is. Very good. Thanks, Jason. That was short and sweet. I'll try to be just as, even shorter and sweeter, hopefully. Not sweeter, but shorter, perhaps. So because time is brief, I want to make three very quick points about the strengths of Jason's approach and the things I like about it, and then raise three questions for more discussion afterwards. So the first point is about the humanity-nature interface. I think one of the real strengths of his approach is an attempt to transcend this, as you just called it, a binary. And I think that's one good way to think about it. To try to look at the evolution of world history as humanity embedded within ecosystems, and so there's a kind of a mutual development and coevolution, if you will, of various species, various life forms of which humanity is one. And this, there's a lot more that could be said about this. I'll use a reference which you didn't use, but I assume would accept, which is, of course, to Dialectic of Enlightenment, where at the end of that book, Adorno and Horkheimer say that the humanity-nature binary is one of the most fundamental, I think they use the word sins, of European philosophy. And I think his work is a way of making up for that sin to some degree. Second point, the role of capital accumulation in environmental crisis, if we can use that word for a minute, is absolutely central to his work, and I think rightly so. And I'm not going to say any more about it except to make one point, and that is that part of the importance here is that some of the solutions being proffered, as I'm sure many of you know, for the environmental crisis have to do with capital accumulation themselves, or forms of capital accumulation. And I'll just reference a few things, not only the whole ideology of sustainable development, which is about sustaining economic growth and accumulation, but also various forms of green capitalism, from the Green Revolution onwards, the fad for geoengineering, whatever that means. Perhaps it's fantasy, but nevertheless, I think it's a potential source of investment capital anyway, and so on. All of these things, I think, are exposed to some degree by focusing on capital accumulation as one of the most important, if not the most important driver for environmental crisis. And another way to put that is simply, we have to stop accumulating capital, at least to the degree that we're currently doing it, otherwise we're not going to solve this crisis. Now, third and last point of praise, before I get to the criticisms, has to do actually with the theory of capital accumulation. I think this is a big part of the innovation of Jason's work, is to look at the natural inputs in the process of capital accumulation. So, of course, we've been taught classically that labor is the crucial input. It's what gives raw materials, natural resources value. It's not that that's not true, but it's also, I think, the point that Jason's making centrally here, that we need cheap inputs. We need cheap natural inputs, natural resources, or the process of accumulation can't get off the ground. And I think that's a crucial insight that you can find in Marx and other writers, but it's not emphasized to the degree that I think is really necessary, and I praise Jason for doing that. Now to the problems. One is going to be about the notion of cheapness, and two about the notion of capital or capitalism. So the first thing is, I think we need to talk about what cheapness means more. And this is partly in the form of a question. But first of all, I think we have to ask, cheap for whom? The ability for capital to offload costs is considerable, as I'm sure you know. And that's going to mean that things are cheap for certain people, but not for others. So this ability of offloading costs, including to the state, right, at certain points, the notion of resource wars, so you actually just capture increasingly scarce materials. They remain cheap for you, not so for anybody else. So I think the idea of cheapness is something that we have to unpack a little bit, though I think it's a very useful one. Also, I'm not totally convinced, I'd like to be, but I'm not totally convinced by the idea that cheap nature is ending. I think that in some sense of ending, I don't want to be too blunt about this, but just to throw out some things, new forms of cheap energy production or presumably cheap energy production from, natural gas to fracking and so on. We need to talk about that. Industrially produced food and food substitutes, right? So as natural sources of protein and get more expensive, the idea of manufacturing, and of course meat in the lab and so on, and other forms I think can be used. And finally, and this is something I'm going to return to, population. Population increase is making labor, or continuing to make labor, extremely cheap. There's huge populations on the move, of course, migrants and others, that are willing to work at subsistence level or even below subsistence level as long as they're bringing in income. And I think that this sort of drastic population crisis that you see in places like South Asia and elsewhere creates a downward pressure on wages that's going to make labor continue to make it cheap in many ways. So I'm on the fence about this. I'd like to believe that you're right, that a certain era is ending, but I think there's counter evidence, and maybe we need to talk about that a little bit more. Second, about capital accumulation. Now, I like your emphasis on it, but I have to say, and I know you're going to think this is unfair, I have to say that the book reads sometimes as a kind of monocausal theory of world history. I know you're arguing against the historians that have focused on the Industrial Revolution, and I think you have a good point to make. But certainly, they also have a good point to make that the combination of a building process of capital accumulation by the late 18th and particularly more in the early 19th century combines with certain innovative technologies to really create a takeoff, not only an economic takeoff, but also in terms of environmental degradations of various sorts. I don't think you have to deny that I don't think accepting that will mean that you lose the emphasis on the earlier period where capital accumulation is the main driver without the sort of technological and industrial overlay. And similarly about your, I think, slightly unfair attack on the idea that humanity is the problem. I agree with you. Humanity as a whole is not the problem. That's painting with too broad a brush. But I do think that it's too easy to say that population is not a problem. And I think population increase does track very closely, if you look at this geographically, to forms of environmental degradation, no matter the social system actually in play. I think it is an independent variable, and I think that people make reference to humanity as a main driver of environmental crisis. They often have in the back of their minds, or maybe implicitly, that it's actually population increase. Humanity beyond a certain point, change in quantity, to quote my old friend Hegel, becomes a change in quality. At a certain point, population becomes now an independent variable and creates problems of its own, or at least that's what I would tend to argue. The response, I hope, we'll see what it is. And finally, third point, having to do with capitalism. I like the emphasis on capital accumulation. I like less I think, somewhat reified use of the notion of capitalism, and here's why. If you're going to talk about capitalism, you have to talk about socialism. And there's almost nothing in this book about socialism. And I think there's a very good reason for that, because there's not much to say about it. It on the one hand, doesn't exist. And on the second hand, even if it were to exist, would not necessarily provide a solution to the environmental problems that you point to. And so it seems to me that actually there's a certain rhetoric about capitalism, and I think it's not just rhetoric. I think it's partly your theory of sort of historical causality, and you know, there are other things involved. I think it's a deep commitment to some degree, but I think it partly gets in the way of looking at real solutions to real problems. Capital accumulation is not going to go away in the foreseeable future, but it may be limited and circumscribed in various ways by alternative forms of producing wealth. And in fact, those alternative forms of producing wealth already exist and have always existed and haven't gone away. So capital accumulation works in tandem with other forms, whether it's agroecological innovations in the South, or it's forms of cheap energy production that exist that don't turn a profit, but nevertheless, as it were, get the job done for people in various parts of the world. All of these exist now. Presumably you and I are both in favor of increasing them, but I think the rhetoric of capitalism, socialism, and so forth actually gets in the way of talking more concretely and specifically about what the necessary solutions are and how we can circumscribe, though not perhaps eliminate, this engine of accumulation that you pointed to so well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Omar. So I'm going to talk a little bit about fuel, energy. It's one of the various different cheaps that Jason and Raj talk about. And one of the wonderful things about their book is the way in which they start with a very specific incident or historical moment and then tease it out and show how all of these world-spanning circuits of material flows and power can be traced coming out of that one particular moment. And in their section talking about energy, actually, very much in line with what Jason just said, they go back before what is seen as the kind of advent of fossil capitalism, with coal in northern England, to the peat bogs of the Netherlands, and talk about peat and capital accumulation and ecological crisis and the ways in which the rise of Dutch power and capital led to the creation of continent and even world-spanning series of economic relations and forms of power, which, with a corporation like Royal Dutch Shell, we're still seeing today. So I wanted to sort of mimic Jason's strategy by starting with one particular historical anecdote and then asking some questions coming out of it. And that has to do with a moment in 1930 when a man named Columbus Joyner discovered the great East Texas oil field. He was one of the wildcatters who found what got memorialized in films like Giant and in the TV series Dallas as the great kind of gushers of Texas oil country. The problem was that it was 1930. So just as he found this huge source of great economic wealth, the need for so much oil was drying up, and the means to buy it was no longer around. And as a result of that, there was a real economic and political crisis. In fact, the governor of Texas sent the National Guard into the East Texas oil fields to shut production down, believe it or not. And shortly thereafter, the president at the time, FDR, seriously considered nationalizing oil reserves in the United States. The idea was that, in fact, oil had become so cheap that it was no longer economical to produce. It had to be above a certain level in order for oil companies to actually make enough money to keep drilling it out of the ground, even though that's a pretty inexpensive thing to be doing. So, what this, I think, raises is some of the very complex questions relating to the price of oil and the way in which oil and its economic cost, its cheapness, is often determined by a whole congeries of different factors that have to do with very complex questions of geopolitics, governance, technology, markets, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the questions that I think comes out of that moment from the past is the question of cheapness and of price mechanisms and the ways in which oil is controlled and fuel and energy is controlled today. And so the question that I have, in some ways, is very much connected to one of Omar's questions, and that has to do with, what might appear to be cheapness, and the ways in which it's a product of pretty complex determinations. And if we think about the current moment, right, oil was extremely expensive, but now because of extreme action and these new extreme extraction and new technologies, it's become quite cheap. But that's not the only reason. It also has to do with the fact that Saudi Arabia is refusing to up its production quotas as it did last time a lot of production was coming online. So the basic point here is that cheapness has to be thought in a very kind of complex way. In fact, we might not even understand all the determinants of cheapness. So that's one sort of question. How does cheapness get produced, and what do we mean when we talk about cheapness? Another question relating to oil and fuel has to do with the specific political factors that determine it and the kind of historical specificity that come with it. I'm thinking specifically about Timothy Mitchell's arguments in Carbon Democracy, where he contrasts coal and the ways in which the actual substance of coal, the way that it had to be brought up out of the ground by a mass workforce, transported through very specific nodes from quite geographically distant coal mines by railroad to cities, could actually empower workforces. And Mitchell argues that the power of miners to go on strike and in collaboration with railway workers and people on the docks and in other really important nodes, there could be a real drive for democracy. So there's a very big difference between the kind of political capacity which coal can produce and the ways in which oil functions politically, Mitchell argues. So how does that kind of specificity of lively matter, one might say, the difference between coal and oil, how can one fit that into the kind of highly capacious theory of cheapness and the production of cheapness that Jason advances in his work, particularly since, as Omar said, Jason is really very much trying to be aware of the interaction between humanity and the things of the world and see the creation of things as a kind of dialectical process. And the last question I have is a more kind of speculative question, not just for Jason perhaps, but for all of us. And that has to do with the argument that fuel, and specifically oil, is very much connected to biopower and to our sense of who we are. Americans and all of the lifeways connected to the United States during the so-called American century of the last 50 years or so have taken cheap energy for granted. So how do we really move beyond that? How do we create the kind of political willpower to shift, as well as the kind of political movement that's necessary to fight against corporate elites and their current control of our government, basically, in order to keep their stranded assets in oil production valuable somehow. So, how can a theory such as Jason's help us create a mass movement, which is going to be transformative in the way that we need it to be, which obviously, we're facing complete ecocide in the future, as well as for significant numbers of people in the present. So those are my 3 questions for Jason.
Is this? Oh, it's already on. That's the trick. I can't believe that guy's name was Columbus. Just to say. Thank you for that, for the work you've done. I really appreciate the kind of ambitious, interdisciplinary, sprawling analysis of capitalism and nature in relation to these cheapening things and reframing the Anthropocene as the capitalist scene. Working through the 7 cheap things really does make clear that the interlocking and relational nature and the fluid nature of capital and capitalism and nature, and how these relationships and all of their contradictions might be remade and reimagined, which the conclusion of the book, which is shorter than, we're always get better at defining the problems. But at least there's an inspirational part at the end, a call to something else. And the book goes some distance in that, in reimagining nature and capitalism. The arguments presented in the book around nature and capitalism intersect in many ways with things I've been thinking about and writing about over the years. And I want to point out a couple of those things in a way that complement, with an E, but also complement your work, and also call it into some of it into question. So by way of shorthand, and it's interesting that both of you mentioned what the cheapness is, because you talk about cheapness as a battleground, and I think that's an interesting way to frame it, and completely agree. But I think it's possible and useful to think about the battleground and some of its outcomes and possibilities through social reproduction as an organizing framework. While social reproduction is implicit throughout the book, you don't really discuss it as such, and I wonder why. Because the battleground in question is waged almost completely within that realm of the material social practices of social reproduction. All the cheap things are resonant to that. What else is care work? What else is food? What else is lives and work? And really the other 3 things as well. And also, why distinguish care work and work? So that's it's a little side question. But as Marxist feminists have long argued, the unpaid work at labor that's often not even recognized as labor, of producing labor power in the form of laboring bodies on a daily basis and on a generational basis, so that these bodies can sell their labor power to capital, is foundational to the extraction of surplus value. And the source of profit, which I also think there's a little slippage in the book about what the source of profit is. Just saying. But in addition to all that messy, fleshy, embodied domestic stuff, there's also a reproduction of cultural forms and practices that produce and reproduce the differentiated labor force and naturalize it as such. And the book covers the cheapening battlegrounds of making and maintaining racialized, gendered, colonized workers and labor forces and workplaces and extractive zones, but not as projects of social reproduction. And I wonder why, not because social reproduction is my thing, though it is, but because I think it offers a vibrant way of understanding the issues that drive the book and suggest other ways of organizing around them. But also, as a geographer, I'm following Marx, I want to underscore that part of social reproduction, and this is my little part of that argument, is that it's also reproducing the means of production, in which I would include the physical environment, built and so-called natural, the waterways, mineral resources, factories, land, etc., which are the means, part of the means of production. And as others have argued, the exploitation of nature and women and non-white peoples are of a piece, as are their spoilation and disabling and so on. And it seems to me that looking at those questions through the lens of social reproduction is a good way to get a deeper and wider political economic conjuncture that brings environmental politics together with anti-colonial, feminist, anti-racist class politics. Along those lines, the chapter on work suggests that job because jobs and environments are produced by capitalism and therefore suggest they're common grounds for labor and environmental politics, which would be a great thing and sometimes actually is achieved, they suggest that these constituencies might revisit their fundamental kind of ideologies. They're often antagonistic fundamental assumptions, as paraphrased, as condensed in the phrase, are you an environmentalist or do you work for a living? That shows how old I am, that I remember that famous article. But I also think that it makes sense to look at those material social practices of reproducing a differentiated labor force and the means and environments of production as maybe a better way to create those solidarities and alliances, especially in an embattled and shrinking labor market. As you point out in the book, with the Dakota Access Pipeline, some labor sided with the state and capital rather than with the questions of the environment. So there may be more common grounds off the shop floor, and then eventually on the shop floor. So my second point concerns nature as an accumulation strategy, which I want to pose in connection with the book's arguments around the financialization of nature, which is discussed particularly around cheap energy and capital's ability to profit off of environmental destruction. And they've proven to be quite wonderful, successful at this, as you've pointed out in many great ways. They demonstrate this tendency around the crisis of climate change and looking at how finance capital presents itself as you put it, the mechanism of global salvation. God help us all. Through things like carbon credits and debt for nature swaps and all of that, which you mark it compellingly as an externalization of the collective responsibility for the last commons of the atmosphere. And instead making them a financial product. But also on the chapter cheap money, that you suggest that money is an ecologic relation which under capitalism shapes the condition of existence of all life. And you remark that Wall Street is a way of organizing nature. We can only hope that tonight they're underwater in every way. But I think that these ideas connect to some of the ideas around what I've called nature as an accumulation strategy, in that I wrote about it as alongside and in partnership with political economic shifts associated with neoliberal capitalism. The shifts, I trace it to shifts in anti-colonial and environmental, so it's completely of a piece with the things that you're looking at, movements that began to stir in the 1950s. Nobody wants to think anything happened in the 1950s. But a lot of the seeds of the things that we know and love from the 60s really germinated then. And they were joined then by the oil shocks of the 70s. So as Seven Cheap Things makes clear, when capitalists cannot rely on easy access to nature and to workers as their kind of unproblematic access to exploitation, it provokes a crisis of accumulation. Under those conditions, nature, I would argue, is rescripted by and for capitalists and capitalism and became itself an accumulation strategy. And I think that's different and perhaps a broader way of thinking about it than the financialization, because I think it changed the space-time of nature so that it was no longer extensive, easily accessed, but became intensive and kind of involuted, so that the human genome became the nature to be prospected, biodiversity reserves, so it altered the way nature was an investment in the future that was secured through commodification and privatization, for capital at a later date. And the exclusions from that were people who lived actually near those, on those things that became preserved for later use, and through big pharma, big capital, big NGOs, and the like. And so I think it would be useful, maybe it could be a way of thinking top down and bottom up, to think of the financialization and the way nature as an accumulation strategy reworks the time and space and closing of the commons, a commons of knowledge, as well as nature itself. Thank you.
Okay, well, Jason, we've peppered you with questions.
Boy, how do I, these are amazing. What an amazing conversation. Let's see what I can remember, and then the audience and my colleagues up here can help me
I think
point
you
out
should
what I
choose
forget.
the ones you want.
So about social reproduction, yes, absolutely. I think the challenge is, how do we tell world histories of that? And it's something that comes out, I think, more strongly in Capitalism and the Web of Life, which really foregrounds this relationship of capital accumulation and points as one grounded in the unpaid work of social reproduction, but also the unpaid work of various natures. One part of that, I think, that has maybe attracted the least attention, and it speaks to the question of population as well as to the question of cheapness that Omar highlighted, is that there is an orthodox Marxist approach which says the value form, the commodity, and the value relations are identical. And they're not. And this is something that Marxist feminists from the 70s, but I think maybe best crystallized by Lise Vogel's work in the early 1980s, made clear that the relations necessary for expanded value accumulation are necessarily much broader and expand beyond the cash nexus, necessarily. So I think that for me, as I struggled, and I'm sure you struggled for much longer, as I struggled to make sense of that dual systems impasse that arrived in the 80s. How do you carry that forward? That was fundamental to my own reimagining of capitalism and how value, this turgid Marxist phrase, the law of value, how value works. But it's really complicated, isn't it? Because we have capital's project of value, and then we have the processes of upending that project. So the project of value is that fantasy that I think nature as an accumulation strategy captures, of nature as an interchangeable part, that everything is infinitely fungible and interchangeable and all the rest. But human and extra-human natures at every point are upending that process. And so the story of social reproduction has to be fundamental to it. That speaks to the question, population this might be one of our sharpest disagreements, absolutely not an independent variable. And the blame can go on demographers, which have ruined the question, but also on Marxists who have not paid attention to the question of, some exceptions that I'll highlight, but to what Marx calls special laws of population, that there are historically and combined and uneven geographically articulated relations of population that is fundamental to the history of capitalism. Indeed, in a more recent talk that I published as an article on World-Accumulation, Planetary Life, I made the point that it seems so obvious to feminist historians of women's history, that the massive expansion of the European proletariat in the 2 centuries before 1800 was only possible through the prodigious unpaid work of women in this period, and reinforced by all those kinds of violences and restructuring of a very strong gendered binary, the story that Federici and many others have told for early modern Europe. Of course, not only an early modern European story, but also a colonial story with the Jesuits teaching indigenous peoples to beat their children and all that kind of thing. So, I mean, this question of social reproduction and violence and population has to be there. I think you're absolutely right. The question is, and this is really a call. I think I have some graduate students that I sort of cajole into doing this, but we have to take this question of social reproduction as fundamental to these great eras of capitalist development to understand both the development of the contradictions, but also the resolution of them. So that's crucial. We are absolutely not only at the end of cheap nature, but at the kind of dialectically catastrophic inversion of that process with climate change. Climate change not only signals the end of the road for the long 5-century journey of finding sources of unpaid work energy outside the system and bringing it into the system on truly massive scales. I mean, if you think of the Colombian invasion and that project to reunify Pangaea after 175 million years, that is an absolutely fundamental geological moment in the history of the planet, engineered not by humanity, but by Christendom, by empires. And this speaks, I think, to deeper questions, and I'm reminded of this discussion around nature as an accumulation strategy and bioprospecting and biopiracy. And of course, I've been very influenced by that whole discussion. And so I started digging back into this, and as a geographer, I started looking at the history of science and the history of cartography. Well, it turns out, what is the first thing that every great European empire did? Well, they established a geography department. They established, the Dutch East India Company, they're giving uniform and absolutely precise instructions to their pilots to map the planet, to map the coastline, map where the valuable sources of potential profit are to be found, that the emergence of capitalism signals not just the emergence of a kind of enlightenment or sensibility, or what Weber calls the European rationality of world domination, but it also signals this profound nexus of big science, big money, and big empires together. And that gives us some fundamental clues to how the modern world was shaped. Now, the question of energy, how do we deal with that? I think the point that I would make is that there have been no energy transitions, only energy additions, right? In the history of the modern world. So it's not like coal went away when oil came online, right? I think the Mitchell story is a wonderful story. I wonder if it looks very different if you tell it from the standpoint of West Virginia, though. There's not a lot of democracy in 1920s West Virginia, maybe not a lot today. So I wonder if there's a kind of failure of the world historical imagination there to see the combined and uneven development of how coal goes from being a rock in the ground, right? I mean, people have known about coal forever. The Romans called coal Britain's most important stone. That's what the Romans called coal. And coal was used across the Middle Ages. But it takes specific relations for coal to go from a rock to a fossil fuel. And of course, it's not just peat that comes online as a fossil fuel in the Low Countries, but also coal. The coal revolution in England is a revolution of the 1530s to 1560s. And that's a very interesting point. I think that it's also an era, this era, 1530s to 1560s, this is also an era when a whole lot of other things are going on. You of course, the conquest of the Americas, but even in England, this is the era when our words, nature and society, assume their familiar modern meanings. But it's not just a linguistic point. Andreas Malm sort of mocks me and say, oh, it's not just all about semantics, as if words are somehow beside the point in practical politics. Like every movement for social justice insists on new language of naming the system and naming the justices and injustices that are central to a movement project. But this is the era in which nature and humanity, nature and civility, society, become real abstractions, not just ideas floating out there in the ether, but actual, meaningful, lived experiences of domination and violence. So it's not just the coal revolution, it is the defeat of Kett's rebellion in 1549, the high tide of agrarian resistance in England to the agricultural revolution. It is the ongoing expulsion of surplus populations or populations rendered surplus and the growth of extra agricultural workforces in that era twice as fast as the agricultural population. But also fundamentally, this is the era in which the modern conquest of Ireland begins. So this is the era in 1541. So if you've ever used the expression beyond the pale, that's the colonial line around Dublin. And beyond the pale were the wild Irish. That's always how the English of the 16th century were talking about the Irish. They were wild, they were savage, they were not part of humanity. And so I think that we're really trying to destabilize this way of talking about planetary crisis. That the project of saving nature is rooted in a long-standing series of dualisms, not only from René Descartes, and we talk about Cartesian dualism, but also the Columbian dualism, I conquer, therefore I am. Also the Lockean dualism, where he says this very clearly, that the magistrate in the court and the plaintiff, that's a fundamentally different relationship than the master and his slave and the husband and his wife. And that's not an incidental thing in the history of our world. Indeed, the whole concept of wilderness and the kind of ethnic cleansing of the Americas was fundamentally rooted in a Lockean practice of these people, these indigenous peoples they're not us. They're part of nature. And so they can be, they were incapable of improvement, and incapable, indeed, English settlers in Locke's constitution that he writes for the Carolinas, Locke forbids English settlers from entering into contracts with indigenous peoples. Why? Because indigenous peoples were not human. They were not part of civilization. And so I think that we have to have, even in radical ecological thought, a kind of moment of reckoning with these real abstractions and the violence that they have been practically enmeshed in over the past 5 centuries. And also, I think, related to have a kind of a cultural, ideological, materialist critique of how these nature society binaries have worked themselves out in profoundly racialized and gendered and class forms across the long journey of the capitalist world ecology is so fundamental. And I think that it gives us a way out of what I fear to be a reassertion of a kind of economic determinism, economic reductionism in radical environmental studies. This is typified by arguments for fossil capital, and it's all about the steam engine. No, it's not even clear that the steam engine was the most important machine of its era. Look at the cotton gin, which was rooted in genocide and slavery and the frontiers of the Mississippi Delta. That was the condition. Even Marx says this. It's not until the price of cotton collapses that you have steam engines come in. So we have to have a much more, that far from denying the significance of that era, by the way, and if I seem to be arguing that, Omar, I would say, no, but it's a direct and immediate amplification. Yes, a qualitative, up to a point reinvention, but everything we see across the long 19th century is a dramatic global amplification of what we've seen in the previous 3 centuries. And so we need to have a way of getting beyond this old tendency towards economic reductionism, but also this other tendency that I see particularly in North American geography to say, well, we don't have to pay attention to political economy. We don't have to pay attention to things like price history and economic history, which is raised, I think, rightly by your comments. So let me leave it there and then we can open it up.
Okay. Yeah, given the amount of time that the 4 of us have been in conversation, and unless either of you have some burning rejoinder that you would like to make, I would suggest it would make sense to open things for the audience. Omar, you look like you have one thing to say.
We could talk about cheapness, because a couple of us.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
At some point.
Okay. All right. Let's let's keep that question sort of hanging like the sword of Damocles over you. It's the ultimate question which your book poses. And yeah, let's see if anybody would like to bring up a question. I think it might make sense so that we can fit as many people in at once as to take a few questions together, maybe like 2 or 3 questions. So folks out there who would like to pose something, please feel free to.
I have several, but for now, what can you define social reproduction, how it relates? And then also, I guess to reflect the question, other questions, if we haven't read your book, maybe just give a little summary of what cheapness means, and thanks.
Okay, someone else, yes, at the back.
I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about maybe the emergence of things like neo-Malthusian ways of thinking about things in the 70s that coincide with sort of the axiomatics of debt and how those end up producing neoliberal architectures of governance.
Do you want one more? Okay.
I wonder if you could discuss the role of automation and the transference of the mentality that we've built in this relationship between nature and cheap nature and being transferred into that of technology and automation. And do you see a way of breaking the chain before the force of that gets so strong that we don't stand a chance?
Okay, thanks. Right. Who would like to field?
Well, just what is social reproduction? In 2 seconds. It is the everyday reproduction of people as laborers, but as future laborers. So it's the kind of what I've called the messy, fleshy stuff of everyday life. But those are connected in a structured way to a social formation that has demands for a differentiated labor force, people with varied skills, people who have varied interests, and that differentiation and that kind of what it takes to produce that, which is the family, the household, the schools, housing, public space, all of the settings in which we live our everyday lives, also works in certain ways to produce hegemony, to produce a sense that these things are natural, so that women do this work because they have children, and so that naturalizing of it is part and parcel of what then gets exploited by capital, and the kind of connection between that kind of work and nature is one of the arguments that I think it needs to be developed. The other part is that it's reproducing the conditions and means of production. Now, you can narrowly think of means of production as the factory and the machinery. But the means of production, broadly understood, involves resources, what get constituted as resources. The coal in the ground is not a resource until it's mined. The peat is just dirt until you dig it up and then just try and burn it. But all of those things are produced in the labor relation, but when they're destroyed or polluted or totally used up, that's a question of social reproduction and a crisis in social reproduction. And I think it's important to rethink or expand what usually is thought of as social reproduction, if it's thought as all, which is usually just the domestic labor in the household and the kind of settings of reproducing children as future laborers, and to expand that to think about the physical environment opens up a way of a bigger kind of politics around social reproduction and around environmentalism.
Maybe cheapness in 2 or 3 sentences. Well, this argument around cheap nature emerged out of a kind of world ecological history of capitalism and looking at what are the fundamental conditions of accumulation crisis over long centuries of capitalist development, and then what are the conditions for the resolution of these crises, because I was increasingly frustrated by both mainstream and Marxist limits to growth arguments, which seemed to me to be inadequate or partial. And also on the other side, you had Marxist accounts and other accounts of crisis that saw it as essentially internal and not ecological in any sense. So the conditions for great waves of economic expansion in the modern world are massive reductions in the system-wide price of labor, food, energy, and raw materials, what I call the 4 cheaps, which is 7 cheap things as a narrative. So, we have some license with the narrative. But the model itself, in terms of how capital unfolds through world history, is, if you look historically, and yes, there's tremendous regional variation, but if you look historically, you have some combination of rising costs of labor, food, energy, and raw materials that have to be resolved. And they have to be resolved for multiple reasons. One of them ultimately is that the rising prices of the big 4 inputs, labor, food, energy, and raw materials, tends to amplify the surplus capital problem. So that the resolution of great eras of overaccumulation is not only through technological innovation, is not only through various forms of socio-spatial restructuring, it is also fundamentally through the inventions of new nature, through science, empire, and capital, finding, locating, and securing new frontiers. And this means that, capitalism's agricultural revolutions are a fantastic example of this. That model has been spectacularly successful on its own terms in doing basically this, producing more and more food measured in calories or whatever with less and less average labor time. So every bushel of wheat contains less and less average labor time. Until now, and that's stalled out over the past 3 decades. The question about automation is great, and just really quickly, we've been hearing about this for 4 decades. We've been living in the midst of 4 decades of labor productivity stagnation growth. The growth rate has been slowing. Climate change is amplifying that. Climate change is amplifying in many ways, the more fundamental problem, which is that of agricultural productivity growth in the advanced sectors, in advanced capitalist agriculture, which has been stagnating in places like the Punjab from the 90s and places like Iowa from the mid-1980s. And this is a story that Raj Patel and I tell, but also that I tell at some length in other essays and arguments. So at the very best case scenario for capital is an impasse of cheap nature, but really we're seeing an implosion of that process through climate change, which I see as the central geohistorical fact of both accumulation crisis and planetary crisis in the 21st century.
Can I just say something about automation? Because I just recently screened Modern Times, Charlie Chaplin's great critique of industrial production. And there's a really wonderful scene there where Charlie gets, or the little tramp that he's playing, gets fastened into an automatic food machine that is going to feed him while he's doing production on the assembly line. So, of course, we have a lot of fears today about artificial intelligence and how it's going to automate mental labor and take away jobs from middle-class people. Fears of automation, I think, circulated a great deal during the 60s and 70s around, the introduction of robots onto assembly lines. But we can see by looking at modern times that, in fact, forms of automation have always been a strategy of capitals for fighting against working class attempts to increase wages through resistance of various different forms. And that those forms of automation depend on other forms of cheap stuff, right? In the case of the food system that the little tramp is fastened into, of course, it's run by electricity, which is a product of cheap coal. So there we have another instance of the kind of ways in which there are these multiple threads that connect in terms of capital's effort to exploit work and also the natural world. Okay, let's take some more questions. Yeah.
Did you have one?
Person. Oh, over here? Okay, over here first, maybe?
Hello. So you guys are talking a lot about capitalism being bad, but I would like to pose the question, could it be a solution to this problem? Because okay, capitalism is a very good mechanism for exploitation, but could you basically use this to gather the resources to solve some of the problems that we're having now? For instance, we've developed solar energy, right? So we're using that as an alternative. I think Chile's now is going to pave the Andes in solar panels so that they don't have to use, non-renewable resources. So, I'm wondering whether maybe the criticism of capitalism is a little bit too strong, because it is a driving force for our evolution. And yes, we have some problems now where there's short-term incentivism. If you're a CEO, yes, you need to make your, profit target, or you'll lose your job, and you don't care about the negative impacts you're having on other people. But could you use this process to actually solve some of the problems that we're having? I mean, you have, anyway, done. Thanks.
Do you want another one? We have 3 over here, and then
Okay, all right, well, we'll turn over here and come over to you, okay?
Thank you all for very efficient and clear talks tonight. It was great. I'm sort of interested in whether this explaining the cheapening of different forms of labor through this binary mapping of society nature actually holds when you look historically at a lot of these different systems, because very often it's not one type of labor and then cheap labor. Very often it's a whole host of stratifications in between. And whether you look at classic American scientific management that had, Poles are good at this, Russians are good at this, Irish are good at this, all of which were cheap, but which produced something much more than a binary when it came to a labor market. And then even if you look at cases of settler colonialism, there's a lot of variation in how indigenous populations are treated and incorporated into the economy or not. And so I'm sort of interested in whether saying that the people who are made cheap are all just subsumed into this category of nature as opposed to society, whether that under-describes what's actually a much more complex process. Thank you.
Okay, do you want me to come back? Okay. Do you want to, should we do 4?
Yeah, we'll do 4.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm interested in how cheapness plays out in the kind of already existing wounds of the capitalist scene, after natural disasters, with Superfund sites, instances of terrible industrial pollution. How does cheapness play out in the kind of management of those places? Of the, is there a cheap relief, cheap healing, that kind of thing?
Thank you. Okay, last but not least, we hope. Yeah, I wanted to segue from the first of the last 3 questions, which he really just kind of set me up, because in responding to Omar Dahbour's question about aren't we placing too much emphasis on anti-capitalism, it seems to me that that is where we actually need to place the most emphasis. And if we do not see the replacement of capitalism by the associated producers and a democratic planning of an economy and socialization of the means of production fairly promptly, then we will get what Jeff Mann and Joel Wainwright call climate leviathan at best, or climate behemoth at worst, of a global capitalist order which is authoritarian and seeks to solve and probably fails to resolve the problem of climate change in an authoritarian and anti-human manner. So I think anti-capitalism and socialism need to be front and center in this conversation.
Well, absolutely. We know the people who've caused the problem, and we know their names and addresses. So yes, indeed. So, but I think maybe Omar's point was board, that we do have to have practical short and middle run strategies to buy us time. I mean, this is an argument that Christian Parenti has been making very well, but it reveals the complete pathology and decadence of bourgeoisies today, that there is no political vision to deal with climate crisis. And even if some capitalists, yes, and Cindi, you're right, I mean, cash in on environmental degradation, the climate crisis is bad for capital as a whole, and bad for the survival of capitalism. Now, we might get a more authoritarian version, true, and I think, if anything, that's the argument for a democratic and socialist strategy to fundamentally decommodify key elements of society and to reorganize, especially to reorganize agriculture, because there's going to be no synthesis of ecological and human justice without fundamentally rethinking agriculture. And of course, we're living, one of the things that the Anthropocene in its more geological incarnation gets absolutely right is that we are at the end of the Holocene, a 12,000-year era of relatively stable climate. That is now coming to an end, and we need a relationship to agriculture that is flexible and democratic and pools an extraordinary range of knowledge to adjust and adapt and to climate change and to make agriculture into a net absorber of carbon. So yes, I would agree. Capitalism is tremendously inefficient and wasteful and violent and oppressive at every single step. And it's not about markets either. Markets have long predated capitalism, so it's not like you can't have markets. Is it more complex than that? Well, of course. I mean, of course. But is it true that in virtually every major episode of colonial and imperial conquest and advance, the people living in those parts of the planet become uncivilized, they become lazy, they become basically savage and wild? And this is a notion that is deeply inscribed, especially in American environmentalism, the question about neo-Malthusianism. I mean, the founder of the Sierra Club, John Muir, was describing Indians and Mexican Americans and Latinos and others as dirty and lazy and everything like this. Of course, also celebrating the wilderness as somehow untouched. Like, no, people never lived in North America before the conquerors came. I think so we can't do justice to all of it, but I think the thing about neo-Malthusianism is that it is as much a response, it is in some ways more, and this comes out in a book I'm finishing now, it is as much or more a response to working class and anti-colonial revolt as anything. And this was the case for Pop, for Malthus. Yes, his students actually called him Pop. And he marries not just the environmentalist sensibility, but the imperial sensibility, because of course he was chair of political economy at the College of the East India Company. And so, and he was writing at the moment of, in 1798 when that first essay appears, he was writing at the end of this 25-year period of the most extraordinary anti-systemic revolt and class struggles that the modern world had ever seen. In Ireland, in England, in France, in Haiti, in Russia, in Peru, in America. And a similar story can be told about sort of Paul Ehrlich and that neo-Malthusianism that emerges in the late 60s and 70s, very much a response to worker and anti-colonial revolt. And I think that we haven't come to terms with neo-Malthusianism as a fear of the working class and a fear of anti-colonial, of decolonization, nearly to the extent we should.
I just want to add a comment about, it's an interesting counterpoint between the two questions, and I think it illustrates my last query to you. Jason, I think we're totally in agreement on the substance, but I think my question was, I think the rhetoric of socialism, capitalism, and so forth doesn't serve us well here. And it is partly, as you said, about short-term solutions, but it's also about how the rhetoric gets in the way of dealing with the problems. And you gave the perfect example, is about agriculture. Yes, we have to revolutionize agriculture and use new and both old and also forgotten techniques to revitalize that. But the language of socialism is of absolutely no help in terms of revising our techniques for agricultural production, revisiting that sector. It's an ideology of change in the ownership of industry and so-called advanced means of production, not the things that underlie that, as you rightly point out, or agriculture, food production, basically. So I think that rhetoric of socialism doesn't help there, aside from the fact of what it might mean or not mean, definitionally speaking, and also the rhetoric of capitalism, because as you said, the market is in some places a useful mechanism for this. Think about solar energy production. The market is actually in front of the state right now. The state is not doing what it could do. And in fact, market solutions of some sort might be something that can lead us, lead in advance of whatever state policies there are in terms of energy and perhaps even other things as well.
I didn't read in this book that socialism was the answer. And I think that was important. And in the conclusion where you talk about something else, it's much more about collectivization and much more about reimagining work and non-work, rethinking how time works under contemporary conditions. And so the old things, certainly capitalism is so not the answer and so much the problem. I'm sorry, but I'm not even going to talk about that. But you're not saying socialism is the answer, but some other kind of collective, shared, decentralized, redistributive sense of what's happening. Unless I missed
absolutely
some
right.
keywords.
That our call for reparation ecology is not just to repair, to heal, but also to insist on remembering the violence of capitalism. And indeed, for the very example that you cite around solarization, the Germans, I go to Germany and they're like, 25% of our energy comes from renewables. And I'm like, yeah, but your carbon budget keeps going up. And that's capitalism. And so I think that we need to name the system. And I think that is not, it's rhetoric, but it's all rhetoric. So is that better than other rhetoric? I guess that's all in the eye of the beholder. But what radicals have always insisted is we need to name the system. And I think that's what this book insists upon, that the system is one that was born in 1492. It emerged out of the violence and depredations of a particular kind of militarized production and commercial apparatus, and that's something we can't forget.
If I can just sort of wade in very quickly here too. I think one of the foremost demands of the largest peasant organization in the world today, Via Campesina, is for radical land redistribution, right? Because it's small peasant agriculture, which has been shown, even the World Bank agrees with this, that, peasant agriculture is actually the most productive way forward. So we're not talking about vertical farming or hydroponics or genetic engineering or something like that. We're talking about putting the land in the hands of the increasingly dispossessed peasant masses. And, of course, historical socialism has made lots of mistakes, and there are lots of different varieties, but one of the major factors of anti-colonial revolutions, many of which called themselves socialist, was land redistribution. So, I think maybe to push you a little bit, maybe we should be talking about socialism, and it can be a solution in as much as it's based on, putting the means of production in the hands of the people who are producing.
You're here.
Let's see how much time we have. Let's just take oh my gosh, we've got a lot of questions and only 5 minutes left. So we'll take the questions of 1, 2, 3 people. Please make your questions very quick.
Yeah, hi. I'm sorry that I actually missed the opening, your presentation, but I was coming from a meeting of someone representing the coalition of Immokalee workers, and their demands and what they demand companies to sign on to, the fair farming program, a penny more per pound of tomatoes picked, human rights code of conduct so that growers and the overseers on the ground will have consequences if they violate clean water, clean bathrooms, shade in sunny Florida, and also freedom from sexual violence and abuse of most vulnerable workers. So how do you conceive of intellectuals and in theory, Marxist theory, whatever, anti-capitalist theory relating to those struggles? I know that there's going to be a stop at Wendy's on March 8th at the international, the Women's Strike March at Wendy's and someone from the Immokalee Workers Coalition is going to be there. So, yeah, can you talk some more about that? Sorry for taking so long.
Yeah, I don't think there is a price for nature because nobody made it. So cheap nature, if that's the regime we had and it led to such inequality, I cannot imagine what expensive nature is gonna do to inequality. No human being made nature, so nobody should give a price to it. And in terms of labor, stop treating yourselves as slaves. You do so much slave labor for companies like Facebook and Google. You create their content, you create their traffic, and you don't get nothing for it. So, and also for the corporations, we are the consumers that pay the high prices that give them the privilege to create so much wealth. And last comment, the system is not capitalism, it's good old feudalism. So stop doing it a favor by calling it capitalism. Thank you.
Hi, I cannot hold myself out of this conversation. Probably you hear why. I lived most of my life in the Soviet Union, and in the sense of ecology, both systems did not do a good job. But after living here, I could say a lot about it, but I just don't have time. But when I'm here for more than 20 years, and I consider that's problem not only in capitalism, probably in democracy. Because what has happened during this election, it's the result of real democracy, when real people, got conquer the tools that they could use, and they choose whatever they want. So it's a real question what we really could do and why it's always failed, why we fail all the time, why right now most people in Macy's not here, and whatever you do, whatever you tell them, they probably vote for something like they voted last time. So what we really can do, why we fail?
Why do we fail? Well, capitalism has succeeded on its own terms, so I'm not so sure that the Soviet project was outside of capitalism. Feudalism, no. If we were Norman peasants in the 11th century, our work year would have been about 1,100 hours. In fact, feudalism was a much more humane system than capitalism. And I can tell you this because we can geek out about medieval economic and class history and environmental history if you want afterwards. But no, let's not. This is capitalism. Yes, of course we should support labor struggles. I mean, all of us are differentially located and can do some things and not others. But the question that was raised for me is that around agriculture and labor is that we have to have a political strategy. We have to stop our fear of the state and indeed to deal with these big questions of how energy and work and food and agriculture agriculture are articulated, it will not be enough simply to accrete local struggles, that we have to have a political strategy. And that's going to be difficult to do. It's easy to call for a movement of movements, but what will be the common ground? And I think you're right, that the social reproduction and a broader conception of work that sees that, yes, extra-human natures work. And by the way, yes, human beings produce nature all the time because humans are a part of nature. All species create natures. But yes, we need to look for that common ground. One common ground, not a master key, but one of those is work in a manifold and expanded way, crossing production and social and reproduction, paid and unpaid, human and extra-human. And that's going to be fundamental, because one of the lessons of 20th century socialism was that excluding other people, women, peoples of color, colonial peoples, from that project and saying, well, first we're going to have socialism, then you can have liberation. We have learned time and again just how corrosive and dangerous that was, and we have now the opportunity to understand that in any socialist project, nature with an uppercase N cannot be treated as a productive resource. And we have to take that seriously moving forward, that we need to see that sustainability and emancipation for all life has to be fundamental. What is it that Marx quotes in the Jewish question? Thomas Munzer, the creatures too must become free. Well, it seemed that wasn't an accident. That wasn't just a young Marx. That was fundamental, I think, to the communist vision.
Okay, thank you. The creatures too must become free. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.